Hey everyone, this is one of those stories that begins quietly, the kind that pretends to be small until it suddenly stands up and takes the room. Before the truth surfaced, before the papers changed hands and the power shifted, there was a woman moving through a house she owned like a shadow that didn't know it belonged to the light yet. Take a second, breathe this in, tap like, subscribe for stories where dignity rises from dust, and welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where silence turns into strategy and patience becomes a crown. The New Year's Eve party had ended the way storms often do, leaving debris scattered everywhere and a strange calm that felt more insulting than the noise before it. The house was still humming with leftover laughter embedded in the walls, echoes of clinking glasses, spilled drinks dried into sticky reminders on marble counters. Streamers drooped from doorframes like exhausted witnesses, and the scent of expensive perfume mixed with fried food lingered in the air, heavy and uninvited. She stood barefoot on the cold floor of the kitchen long after the last guest had stumbled out, holding a trash bag that was already too full, absorbing the quiet as if it had weight. She had not been invited to celebrate. Not really. She had been assigned a role, handed an invisible uniform, and placed somewhere between furniture and hired help. From the moment the in-laws arrived that afternoon, they moved through the house with ownership in their steps, greeting each other loudly while barely acknowledging her presence except when something needed doing. Plates had been passed into her hands without eye contact. Empty glasses had appeared beside her elbow as if by magic. Laughter rose in the living room while she wiped counters that had never truly been dirty. The irony lived deep in the walls. The house itself knew the truth even if the people inside it did not. It had been hers long before the marriage paperwork, long before the family gatherings and assumptions. She had bought it quietly years earlier with discipline forged through sacrifice and long nights. It was a symbol of independence, a fortress built from self-belief. Yet that night she moved through it like a guest afraid to sit on the furniture. Her husband had disappeared into the party early, absorbed into the gravitational pull of his family. He wore comfort easily when surrounded by people who reminded him of who he had been before responsibility demanded more. She noticed how his laughter grew louder around them, how his posture shifted, how his eyes slid past her as if she blended into the background decor. It was not cruelty in the dramatic sense. It was neglect polished smooth by habit. As midnight approached, the energy in the house had sharpened. Voices grew bolder, judgments looser. She overheard comments carried on careless air, remarks about how lucky she was, how she had married into something, how she should be grateful. Gratitude was expected to flow downward, never upward. She swallowed the words she wanted to release because she had learned the power of observation. Queens in waiting do not rush the coronation. When the countdown ended and cheers erupted, she stood alone in the kitchen, watching the microwave clock blink past midnight because no one had bothered to reset it. The new year arrived without ceremony for her, marked only by the scrape of plates and the ache in her shoulders. While champagne spilled in the living room, she scrubbed a pot that did not need scrubbing. While resolutions were toasted, she made a quiet one of her own, unspoken but solid. The party dissolved slowly. Coats were grabbed, keys searched for, laughter turned sloppy. One by one, the in-laws claimed couches and guest rooms as if the house were an extension of their own entitlement. No one asked if she was tired. No one offered help. The assumption sat heavy and unchallenged. This was her place. Cleaning was her contribution. Silence was her role. She worked methodically, not out of obedience but out of strategy. Every bag tied, every surface wiped, every room restored was an act of reclaiming space. The house seemed to breathe easier as order returned, as if recognizing her touch as familiar and rightful. Her reflection in the darkened window looked older than she felt, eyes steady, jaw set. There was no self-pity there, only calculation. As dawn crept in through sheer curtains, she finished the last task and stood still, listening to the house wake up. Somewhere upstairs someone snored. A television hummed softly in a forgotten room. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly, grounding herself in the present moment. The new year had arrived and with it a shift that no one else sensed yet. She did not go to bed immediately. Instead she walked into her private office, a room she kept locked not out of secrecy but out of necessity. Inside the air was different. Controlled. She opened a drawer and removed a folder, thick with documents that carried more weight than any insult she had endured that night. Ownership papers rested inside, quiet and undeniable, bearing her name alone. They were not weapons. They were truth. She placed the folder on the desk but did not open it yet. There was time. Morning would come with sunlight and assumptions. Breakfast would be served with entitlement and expectations. They would wake believing the hierarchy remained unchanged, believing she would continue to move around them like background noise. The house would watch as it always had, patient and knowing. She finally allowed herself to rest as the sky lightened, not in defeat but in preparation. The queen did not need to announce her power in the dark. Daylight would do that for her. And when the morning arrived, when the house filled again with voices that assumed too much, the story would begin to turn. The night had taken its toll, but it had also set the stage. The mess had been cleaned, but the disrespect remained, neatly stacked and waiting. As she closed her eyes, the house held its breath, ready for the moment when ownership would no longer be invisible. Morning arrived without ceremony, slipping through the windows as if it had done this 1,000 times before, illuminating a house full of people who believed they understood its hierarchy. Sunlight touched the countertops she had polished hours earlier, glinting off surfaces that looked effortless now, hiding the labor behind their shine. The house looked perfect, staged almost as if it were preparing for an unveiling no one had been warned about. She woke early not because she needed to, but because control feels best when it is quiet. There was no rush in her movements, no resentment clinging to her steps. She dressed simply, intentionally, choosing comfort over performance. Power did not need decoration today. It needed clarity. As she moved through the hallway, she noticed how the house responded to her presence. Doors opening smoothly, floors steady beneath her feet. It was a subtle thing, but it grounded her. The first sounds of life came from upstairs. A door creaked open. Footsteps shuffled. A cough echoed down the hall, followed by the low murmur of someone already complaining about the morning air. She continued on her path, heading toward the kitchen, where the smell of stale alcohol still hovered faintly beneath the scent of lemon cleaner. She opened windows, letting fresh air sweep through, as if inviting truth to enter along with it. One by one they emerged. Her in-laws appeared with the entitlement of people who had never questioned whether they belonged. They moved through the space freely, opening cabinets, pouring coffee, settling into chairs without asking. Their eyes slid over her the way they always did, registering her presence only in relation to what they expected next. Breakfast. Cleanup. Compliance. She observed without reacting, a quiet witness to her own erasure. The comments began early, drifting through the room like background noise. Remarks about the party, about how much work there had been, about how late everyone stayed up. There was no acknowledgement of who had restored the house while they slept. Gratitude was absent, replaced by expectations so deeply ingrained it did not need to be spoken aloud. Her husband entered last, rubbing sleep from his eyes, already absorbed into the rhythm of his family. He took a seat among them, posture relaxed, comforted by familiarity. She noticed how little space he left beside her, how his attention flowed outward rather than inward. It stung, but it did not surprise her. She had learned the difference between pain that weakens and pain that sharpens. This was the latter. She moved calmly, pouring herself coffee, sitting at the table rather than standing. That alone caused a brief pause, a flicker of confusion crossing a few faces. It was subtle, quickly dismissed, but she noticed it. Queens notice everything. She met no one's eyes, not out of fear, but because she did not need their permission to exist. Conversation continued around her, plans for the day being made without her input, decisions spoken as conclusions rather than discussions. Someone mentioned errands, another mentioned lunch plans. The assumption was clear. She would handle whatever needed handling in the house while they moved on with their day. The role had already been cast in their minds. She finished her coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch just enough to become noticeable. The house itself seemed to lean in. She stood, not abruptly but with intention, and excused herself without explanation. No one questioned it. They rarely did. She walked down the hall toward her office, footsteps steady, spine straight. Inside the room, she closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment, grounding herself. The folder still sat on the desk where she had left it, unassuming, powerful. She picked it up, feeling its weight, the tangible proof of years of discipline and foresight. This was not revenge fueled by anger. This was correction fueled by truth. She took a breath and opened the folder, reviewing the documents not because she doubted them, but because ritual matters. Each page reaffirmed what she already knew. Her name stood alone where others assumed it did not. Ownership was not shared. Authority was not borrowed. This house was hers in every legal and spiritual sense. When she returned to the kitchen, the energy shifted slightly, though no one could have named why. She placed the folder on the table not dramatically but decisively. The sound it made against the wood was soft, yet it cut through the room more effectively than raised voices ever could. Conversations trailed off. Eyes flicked toward the unfamiliar object. She did not speak immediately. Silence is a powerful teacher. She let them sit with the discomfort, with the interruption of their narrative. The house held the moment like a breath paused at the top of the lungs. Finally, she looked up, gaze steady, posture relaxed, and allowed the truth to exist in the open air. There were no shouted accusations, no emotional pleas. Just facts presented calmly, undeniably. The documents were not waved like threats. They were slid across the table with care, offered to be seen rather than forced. Faces changed as pages were scanned, assumptions cracking under the weight of reality. Confusion gave way to disbelief to something quieter and more dangerous. Realization. She watched as the room recalibrated. People who had spoken freely now measured their words. Chairs shifted. Coffee cups paused midair. The house seemed to exhale as if relieved that the truth was finally allowed to sit where it belonged. No one laughed now. No one dismissed her presence. Her husband's expression changed last. It moved slowly from confusion to shock to something like shame. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, stripped of the narrative his family had written around her. She met his gaze without triumph, without bitterness. This was not about humiliation. This was about balance. She gathered the folder back into her hands, signaling that the moment was complete. There was nothing more to prove. The truth did not need repetition. She reminded them calmly that respect was not optional, that assumptions were costly, and that this house was not a backdrop for their entitlement. It was her foundation. No one argued. Power when real does not require defense. The air felt different now, heavier, charged with unspoken recalculations. Plans were quietly reconsidered. Voices softened. The hierarchy they had relied on had collapsed, not with a crash, but with a shift so clean it left no debris. She turned and walked away, not because she was dismissed but because she was done. The house followed her movement, sunlight catching her silhouette as she moved down the hall. Behind her, the morning continued, but it was no longer the same morning it had been an hour earlier. The crown had not been announced. It had been recognized. And as the house settled into this new truth, it became clear that the day was far from over. Ownership had been revealed, but consequences were still unfolding, waiting patiently for the next chapter to begin. The house did not return to normal after that morning. It recalibrated. The walls, once passive observers to entitlement, now reflected a different energy, one sharpened by awareness. Every footstep echoed differently, as though the floor itself demanded intention. She felt it as she moved through the rooms, a subtle but undeniable shift, the kind that happens when truth takes root and refuses to be ignored. The in-laws lingered longer than expected, but their presence had changed shape. Where there had once been comfort, there was caution. Where there had been dominance, there was uncertainty. They no longer moved freely through the house as if it were an extension of their own will. Cabinets were opened more slowly. Chairs were pulled out with care. Even the way they spoke felt edited, as though each sentence passed through an internal filter before being released. She watched it all from a distance, not with satisfaction but with clarity. This was not about watching others squirm. It was about witnessing the natural consequences of truth. Power had a way of reorganizing rooms without ever raising its voice. She remained composed, unhurried, grounded in herself. There was no need to assert dominance further. The foundation had already been laid. Her husband hovered at the edges of her awareness, struggling with the collapse of a narrative he had benefited from without ever questioning. He moved through the house unsure of his place now, caught between loyalty and reality. The familiarity he once enjoyed felt fragile, as though one wrong move could expose how little he truly understood. She noticed his attempts to be helpful, the way he picked up after himself more deliberately, how his eyes followed her as if searching for cues he had never bothered to learn before. He did not guide him. Growth required discomfort. If he was to stand beside her rather than behind assumptions, he would have to find his footing on his own. By midday, the house had become quieter than usual. Conversations were shorter, more careful. Laughter, when it surfaced, sounded restrained, uncertain of its place. The in-laws retreated into themselves, spending more time in guest rooms, on phones, anywhere that felt neutral. The house, once theirs by assumption, had become a mirror they did not enjoy looking into. She stepped outside briefly, standing on the front porch, letting the winter air clear her thoughts. The neighborhood was still, wrapped in that early New Year calm where resolutions felt fresh and possibilities wide. She thought about the years it had taken to build this life, the sacrifices folded neatly into each brick of the house. No one had handed her this. No one had sponsored her strength. It had been earned quietly, deliberately, without applause. When she returned inside, she noticed small but telling changes. Shoes were lined up neatly by the door rather than scattered. Empty cups were rinsed instead of abandoned. These gestures were not apologies, but they were acknowledgments. Respect often begins as imitation before it becomes instinct. Later that afternoon, a conversation unfolded in the living room, one she did not join but overheard in passing. Voices were low, measured, layered with disbelief that had not yet fully settled. There was confusion about how they had misjudged her so completely, how they had mistaken quiet for weakness, patience for permission. It was the sound of people realizing that the story they had told themselves was flawed from the start. She did not interrupt. Let them rewrite it without her help. As evening approached, tension gave way to something closer to humility. Dinner plans were discussed, this time with pauses that waited for her input. Questions replaced commands. It was not seamless and it was not sincere yet, but it was movement. She chose her responses carefully, offering neutrality rather than warmth. Trust, like ownership, was not transferable. It had to be earned. At the table, she sat at the head without announcement. It felt natural, as though the furniture itself had been waiting for alignment. No one objected. No one commented. Plates were passed with care. Eyes avoided hers, then returned, testing boundaries that no longer bent easily. The meal was quieter, but it was honest. Her husband sat beside her, closer than he had in months, posture straighter, expression thoughtful. The ease he once carried had been replaced by something heavier but more real. She sensed his internal reckoning, the slow dismantling of entitlement inherited rather than chosen. Whether it would lead to growth or resentment remained to be seen. After dinner, the in-laws announced plans to leave earlier than expected. The house no longer felt like a playground, and they were eager to return to spaces where their authority went unchallenged. There were awkward goodbyes, polite words stretched thin by discomfort. No one offered instructions or assumptions this time. They left quietly, almost reverently, as though exiting a place that had revealed something they were not ready to carry. When the door closed behind them, the silence felt different from the one that had followed the party. This silence was not oppressive. It was spacious. She stood in the living room, looking around at the space that finally reflected her presence. The house seemed larger now, lighter, as though it had shed a weight it had been carrying on her behalf. She did not clean that night. There was no mess to erase, no performance to maintain. She poured herself a glass of water and sat on the couch, resting in the truth of the moment. The crown, once invisible, now rested where it belonged, not heavy but balanced. Yet beneath the calm she knew this was not the end. Respect given under shock needed reinforcement through consistency. Power revealed once could still be challenged if left unattended. The real work would come in what followed, in boundaries held, in standards maintained, in silence used strategically rather than defensively. As the house settled into sleep, she walked through each room not to inspect but to reconnect. She touched the walls lightly, grounding herself in what she had built. The new year had begun with revelation, but its true test would be endurance. She turned off the last light and headed upstairs, mind clear, spine straight. The throne had been claimed, but rulership required more than proof. It required presence. And as the house fell quiet around her, it was clear that the next chapter would not be about discovery, but about consequence. The days that followed did not rush. They unfolded deliberately, each one pressing gently but firmly against the new reality that had been revealed. The house, now aligned with its true authority, settled into a rhythm that felt intentional rather than imposed. Mornings arrived without tension. Evenings closed without exhaustion. For the first time in a long while she moved through her own space without shrinking. Respect, however, is not proven by a single moment of realization. It is tested in repetition, in habit, in the quiet choices people make when they believe no one is watching. She understood this well. Queens do not confuse temporary compliance with lasting change. So she observed, measured, and adjusted, allowing the truth to do its work while she held the boundaries steady. Her husband tried to adapt, though his attempts revealed how deeply the old dynamics had been rooted. He asked more questions now, checked in before making decisions, offered help where he once assumed it unnecessary. These gestures were not insignificant, but they were uneven, sometimes clumsy. Growth rarely arrives polished. She acknowledged the effort without overpraising it. Accountability did not need applause. She noticed how often he paused before speaking, how he weighed his words as though afraid of misstep. This was unfamiliar territory for him, a landscape where authority was not inherited but earned. She did not rescue him from the discomfort. Partnership required equality, and equality required unlearning. The in-laws kept their distance. Messages came instead of visits, their tone noticeably altered. Where there had once been instruction, there was now inquiry. Where there had been certainty, there was hesitation. They asked about schedules rather than announcing plans, about availability rather than assuming access. It was subtle, but it was progress. She responded politely, firmly, never over-explaining. Boundaries, once established, lose power when constantly justified. The house did not need to host every gathering. Her time did not need to be endlessly available. She chose what aligned and declined what did not, each decision reinforcing the law she had quietly enacted. The first real test came unexpectedly. A weekend approached, and with it, a familiar assumption dressed in new language. A request arrived that sounded polite but carried the weight of expectation beneath it. A small gathering, nothing major, just family, just tradition. The old script lingered between the lines, hoping she would default to her former role. She read the message carefully, noting the careful phrasing, the attempt to appear respectful without relinquishing control. She took her time responding, not out of hesitation but out of intention. When she replied, her words were clear, measured, and final. The house would not be available. The decision was not up for discussion. The reaction was immediate but contained. Disappointment masked as understanding. Silence stretched longer than usual. She did not fill it. The boundary held. Inside the house, the air remained calm. There was no fallout, no argument echoing through the rooms. The power of a boundary is often revealed not in confrontation, but in the absence of chaos when it is respected. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not from denial but from self-trust. Her husband struggled more visibly this time. The old pull of obligation tugged at him, the reflex to appease deeply ingrained. He voiced his discomfort carefully, framing it as concern, as compromise, as peacekeeping. She listened without interruption, letting him reveal the conflict he was still navigating. When he finished, she responded with calm certainty. Peace that required her erasure was not peace. Compromise that only flowed in one direction was not balance. The house, like her life, would no longer be governed by unspoken expectations. He absorbed her words slowly, the weight of them settling in places he had not yet examined. That night the house felt steadier than ever. The walls no longer echoed with unresolved tension. She slept deeply, unburdened by the need to anticipate others' demands. Rest, she realized, was one of the first rewards of self-respect. As the weeks passed, the changes solidified. Her routines became sacred. Mornings were hers. Evenings were protected. The house transformed into a sanctuary rather than a stage. Guests were welcomed selectively, intentionally. When her in-laws did visit, they arrived differently, their presence tempered by awareness. They asked before sitting, thanked her for meals, acknowledged her effort without prompting. It was not perfect. There were moments of old habits resurfacing, of subtle tests disguised as jokes or nostalgia. She met them all with the same calm consistency. Boundaries were not punishments. They were guidelines for connection. Her husband, too, began to shift more authentically. The defensiveness faded, replaced by reflection. He started to see the imbalance for what it had been, not an accident but a pattern. Conversations grew deeper, less guarded. Accountability, once avoided, became a shared language rather than a threat. One evening as they sat together in the living room, the house wrapped around them in quiet affirmation. The space felt earned, protected. She realized then that the throne she had claimed was not about dominance over others. It was about sovereignty over herself. The new year had begun with revelation, but it was being defined by reinforcement. Power, she understood now more than ever, was not a moment. It was a practice. The house no longer questioned her presence. It moved with her, responded to her, reflected her. By the time the final weeks of the new year's beginning unfolded, the shift that had once felt seismic now felt inevitable. Power, when rooted in truth, eventually becomes invisible. Not because it disappears but because it no longer needs to announce itself. She woke each morning grounded, no longer bracing for intrusion or expectation. The silence in the house had matured into peace, the kind that settles deep and stays. Sunlight filled the rooms freely now, no longer exposing imbalance but illuminating order. Every corner of the space carried her intention, her rhythm, her authority. The in-laws had adjusted. Their visits were shorter, more deliberate. They arrived with humility woven into their movements, no longer assuming access to her time or her labor. When they spoke, they acknowledged her decisions without challenge. The house had taught them what words never could. Respect was not optional and ownership was not symbolic. She observed their transformation without pride or bitterness. Vindication was unnecessary. The truth had done its work quietly, efficiently. This was not a story of humiliation. It was a lesson in consequence. Those who had mistaken kindness for weakness had learned the cost of underestimation. Her husband too stood changed. The man who once blended into old patterns now carried awareness in his posture. He moved through the house as a partner rather than a passenger, mindful of space, mindful of balance. The entitlement he had inherited was no longer comfortable, no longer invisible. Growth had not been easy, but it had been honest. They spoke more now, not in defense but in alignment. Decisions were shared without assumption. Disagreements were met with listening rather than avoidance. The house became a place of mutual presence instead of quiet compromise. She did not need to remind him of the truth anymore. He lived inside it. One evening she stood alone in the living room, the same space where laughter had once excluded her, where she had moved unseen and unheard. Now the room felt different, open, reverent. She looked around not with memory but with clarity. This was what reclamation looked like. Not anger. Not spectacle. Just alignment. She thought about the woman she had been on that New Year's Eve, cleaning up a mess that was never hers to carry alone. She did not feel shame for that version of herself. She felt respect. That woman had endured, observed, prepared. She had known when to be silent and when to speak. She had trusted timing over impulse. Queens are not born in moments of victory, but in moments of restraint. The house stood as proof of that wisdom. Every wall, every window, every beam carried the story of self-made power. It was not just a structure. It was a testament. She had built more than shelter. She had built sovereignty. The final affirmation came not from confrontation but from ease. A family gathering was held months later, not because it was expected but because she chose it. She hosted on her terms, welcomed on her conditions. There were no roles assigned, no labor assumed. Help was offered freely, gratitude expressed openly. The dynamic had changed completely. As she moved through the gathering, she felt no need to perform, no urge to disappear into service. She laughed when she wanted, rested when she needed, withdrew when it suited her. The house held her choices without question. The people inside followed suit. Later, when the guests had left and the house returned to quiet, she stood at the center of it all, breathing in the stillness. There was nothing left to prove. The crown had been placed not by ceremony but by consistency. The throne was not a chair or a title. It was the unshakable knowledge of who she was and what she owned, her space, her time, her power. She turned off the lights one by one, each click a reminder of control freely exercised. Upstairs, she paused at the top of the stairs, looking down at the space that had once demanded her invisibility. It demanded nothing now. It honored her presence. This was the end of the story they never thought she would tell. The ending where the woman they underestimated did not raise her voice, but raised her standards. The ending where ownership was revealed, respect was enforced, and a queen took her throne without asking permission. And in the quiet of her dominion, The house stood witness to a truth that would never again be hidden. The queen had arrived,